Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our conversation at the Crossroads. Before I start, I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land we are meeting tonight on any land that you're sitting tonight. I'm on Wurundjeri land close to Mulum Mulum Creek. I would like to also pay my respects to elders, past, present, and emerging, and extend that to any community elder from any other community. I'm Rana Ibrahimi, a member of the coordinating groups of conversation at the Crossroads. We are a growing community based in Melbourne with both a local and global mission to connect people from all walks of life to address the most pressing issues of our time. Many people stress the need for urgent action, given the magnitude of the issues we are facing, and what would such action look like. It's the important thing for us. What we actually need to do, we are asking ourselves, and in many cases, such actions involve conversation at different levels. To us, a large extent of these conversations bring action. I'm honored to have the conversation tonight with Lizzie O'Shea. Before I start the conversation, I'd like to introduce her. Lizzie O'Shea is a lawyer and writer. Her commentary on law, technology, and human rights is often featured on television and radio. Her writing has appeared in New York Times, The Guardian, and Sydney Morning Herald, among others. She is the founder and the chair of Digital Rights Watch, which advocates for human rights online. And she also sits on the board of Blueprint for Free Speech and Alliance for Gambling Reform. At the National Justice Project, she worked with lawyers, journalists, and activists to establish a Watch program, for which she was a recipient of Davis Project's for Peace Prize. In June 2019, she was named a human rights hero by Access Now. Her book, Future Histories, the verso in 2019, looks at radical social movements and theories from history and applies them to current debates on digital technology. It was shortlisted for the Premier's Literary Award. Welcome, Lizzie. I'd like to start with actually asking you, can you tell us a little bit about what led you to take an interest in human rights generally and digital rights in particular?
So you should be able to hear me now. I nearly made the fateful error of being on mute when I shouldn't be, which I suppose is the precursor to every digital event these days. I think what got me interested in human rights was that I was interested in the law because I'm interested in how we make rules, how we organise society, how we organise power, and who gets to say how people get to live their lives. And one of the things about human rights is that it brings ordinary people into that conversation. Instead of treating people as objects without agency that are to be managed by others, it's about giving people dignity and humanity and giving them rights inherent to them, which gives them a source of power to then push that back onto those who exercise power in our society and advocate for reforms that suit the many rather than the few. So it always seemed like an area to me that was very critically important. I also think law is a critically important practice. It's a way to change the world using words. So it can be very powerful, but really only if it's coupled with social movements that can back it up, that can influence how law reform happens so that it is genuinely representing the interests of everyday people, but also so that the strength of any reforms that you win can actually be put into practice. So law was something that I was always interested in, but human rights is the vehicle through which I think we can achieve justice through law, provided that we're working cooperatively with social movements. And I suppose the question about why digital technology is manifold. I, like many people, watched, for example, someone like Edward Snowden many years ago talking about the great capacity of the surveillance state in the United States. And what I've also witnessed is many people who work in this space who see the great capacity of the digital age to bring about liberation and to build resilient communities, to create the spaces for social movements to organise and resist power. So I've seen, I think, as many people have, both the great potential of the digital age, but how it's so often falling short and in fact is empowering the powerful already. And so to me, that becomes a very pressing issue that we can address using human rights as a lens to make sure that we take that power back and reclaim the potential of the digital age.
Thank you so much. It's actually such an important point, and I totally agree. I actually, to just mention that, I forgot to mention that we are recording this interview, which one of the rights that I need to give to the audience. And so for your information, we are recording that. And exactly as you mentioned, I think a lot of us, most of the time, just look at the positive points and the asset and the privilege that technology brings us, while we don't like many other aspects of our life, we don't keep the lens of the human rights and equity in what we are getting and the price that we are paying for this thing that we have as technology right now, especially during this time, that I think it is mostly affected by the technology and use of technology. So I have another question before I ask you to go through amazing presentation that you have. I want to ask, how do you manage to combine your various, you actually addressed it a little bit, but to know more about how do you combine these various roles: professional, lawyer, writer, advocate, and speaker. What is it that drives and inspires you to take all of these multiple roles?
Well, I suppose life is short, so I think you've got to embrace it and grab it by both hands and do what you can with the time available to make the world a better place. I'm very fortunate in that each of the worlds that I occupy have great colleagues. I really love working at a place like Maurice Blackburn, which is my day job. I'm a class actions lawyer there, and that's a law firm that really has come out of the working class movement. It celebrated its centenary last year, so it's the year before last, I should say. So it's a firm that came out of working people that Maurice Blackburn himself sought to provide legal services to working people. So it doesn't surprise me then that it's a place that's full of people who are interested in using law to advance the interests of everyday people rather than big companies or government. So I find that having a job that like that really enlivens my activism. It makes me, I build off the energy of my colleagues to be able to channel that into work in non-profit and community organisations. And it's a real privilege to be the chair of Digital Rights Watch, a relatively new organisation, but again, filled with people who are enthusiastic and excited about bringing a professional and strong advocacy voice into the digital rights space on behalf of human rights principles. And I think it's really interesting as well that despite tech often being associated with men, me and the two staff members at Digital Rights Watch are all women. So there's a lot of interesting women that I get to meet in the tech space, and we've got a big focus on that, which I think is fantastic. So there's a real vacuum, I think, in how government makes tech policy and sometimes how companies deal with civil society in relation to human rights. So there's always a need for this kind of advocacy to take place. And it's a real honour to get the opportunity to do that with great colleagues who work for the organisation and volunteer with the organisation to do so. So there's quite clearly a need for it, and we've got great people doing that work. I suppose I'm one of those people that I wouldn't want to drop any of the balls that I'm juggling, but I think they're all very valuable and important, and they build off each other. So I suppose that's how I fit it all in. This is what I'm doing on a Tuesday night, and it's a real privilege to be with you all and to be able to speak to you. So I'm very honoured to be here as well.
Thank you so much. I'm sure, and we can see how capable you are to keep all of these balls, and it's totally true. And it's so amazing that you're talking about women in STEM as well, because it's an intersectional lens of the whole human rights aspect and gender equity. And I think they're so interconnected that we cannot divide them, basically. And I got to know some amazing women as women of color in STEM as well, that they are connected to the work that you do. And I really enjoy that, actually following all of you in STEM and see how you're interacting and you're trying to grow this movement and this discussion and this dialogue that is really necessary. So I want to invite you to have this conversation. And before we go to the conversation, I actually had the opportunity to have a quick chat with Lizzie, and we agreed that I have the permission to jump in and ask questions in the middle of the conversation. So I thank you for that permission, and I leave the floor to you to start the conversation and have your amazing presentation for us. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rana. Thanks so much to everyone for coming tonight. It's a real privilege to be able to speak to you. I'm always thrilled when people are interested about issues relating to technology and human rights and how we can take back power in the digital age, because I think it's a really important, pressing question. And I certainly don't think you need a computer science degree to be able to think about these problems and to come up with alternative solutions. So it's great to see an engaged and diverse audience here, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity. So I remember back in 2016 when cracks were starting to emerge in the really shiny business model of Silicon Valley. People were really starting to notice how the promise of the digital revolution was not necessarily being realised, and that was occurring in all sorts of profound ways. So it was clear and becoming clear that technology capitalism depended on predatory business practices, it incentivized exploitative models of work, and it was starting to undermine democratic institutions. People were realizing that these big companies were actually cooperating with governments who were really interested in surveilling their citizens. And that experience of online life meant that it was an experience of being watched through a one-way mirror. But just a few short years later, the question is no longer whether industry needs to change, but in fact, how. Discussions about regulating big tech are now common. Data extractive technology projects are often met with criticism. The flexibility of the gig economy has clearly become a millstone around the necks of some of the most vulnerable workers in society. And we can start to see this one-way mirror starting to lose some of its opacity. And we're catching a glimpse of how power is organised in the digital age. So these are really critical times, in my view, for understanding where we've been so that we can map a future that's more democratic. We need context, we need perspective and history if we're going to find a way to tackle profound problems like climate change, like wealth inequality, like the failures of social democracies, all of which I would argue have a technological lens to them. So technology will always have a role, I think, to play in meeting some of these challenges, but not in its current form. So of course, as we're speaking now, the world is settling into the new normal generated by the COVID-19 pandemic. So if some of the fractures were emerging in 2016 with the promise of the digital age, the pandemic has been like an acid wash. It's seeped into our daily lives, stripped them back to their fundamentals, and corroded and deepened the fissures that have predated this moment. Now, this year, and I imagine possibly the year coming, has been one of misery and death for many people. And I think it's very painful to see the mismanagement by those in power be visited upon everyday people in very visceral ways. But I would argue that these crises that are generated by the pandemic are also opportunities. And this is particularly true for those who are interested in talking about making society more democratic. What it's revealed is that the internet is actually more central to our lives than ever before, that its brilliance as a creation of human ingenuity is on full display in this age of social distancing. And we need to find ways to protect its openness and its accessibility and encourage collective creativity that underpinned its development in the first place. But I would say those who hold power are not idle. Already, they're seeking to encode permanence into various aspects of this state of exception to shore up status and profit for themselves. So if technology will continue to play a role in these crises and their aftermath, as well as perhaps more pressing crises that are yet to come, particularly climate change, it really behoves us to consider quite carefully who is making decisions about how technology is built and how it is used and why. And this is the kind of framing that I think we need to bring to these discussions, and I hope to bring to this conversation over the next little while. Who is holding power in the digital age, and what alternatives do we have? So I wanted to use this framing to talk over the next little while about prospects for reform in relation to big tech, which have been an increasingly important issue in recent times, as well as the more obvious context of the pandemic and how technology is used in public health settings. And I want to do that by touching on some of the themes that I've discussed in my book, as well as some of the campaigns we've been running at Digital Rights Watch. So if I don't cover something to the depth that you would like, then feel free to either ask a question or come to me later, or I can also refer to you to things that we're working on or I've written about in the past in case that's helpful. So it's worth remembering that Mark Zuckerberg actually reacted with bemusement when presented with the idea that Facebook may have played a role in the surprising outcome of the 2016 elections. The business model of that platform relies on maximizing its capacity to extract information from users, and filter bubbles, viral disinformation, and polarization are all a consequence of this business model of keeping people on their devices. So Zuckerberg's nonplussed reaction now seems kind of quaint, if not dangerous and outright arrogant, because in the years since, the company has ended up devoting significant resources to mitigating these criticisms, and in fact, taking more responsibility for its curatorial role. Zuckerberg now openly talks about the need for regulation. He drafted an op-ed in the Washington Post explicitly saying this. So the company's actually set up its own oversight board, as you may know, which is staffed by external people, but is designed to scrutinize internal decisions. So the idea that its executive leadership should be able to operate wholly unfettered by regulation is untenable. And they've in fact already shifted their strategy towards limiting and controlling the growing impulse for regulatory reform rather than rejecting it altogether. But of course, go on, Rana.
Sorry, I was going actually to touch base that the fact that when you talk about the democracy and the business model of, for example, Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook, for me as a person who is coming from a country with a totalitarian regime, I actually can compare it more to the type of the control of the totalitarian government than the democratic and capitalism. And it's really making me question that. Do you think really it's like the business model that they have is a democratic model, or the control and it's like a kingdom that they have a king and they're controlling it? How do you see that? And do you think it's more closer to the type of the kingdom and totalitarian government, or there is aspects of democracy in that, or we are just played that we are living in a democratic situation?
It's so funny that you would say that, actually, because Mark Zuckerberg himself has talked about how Facebook is less like a company and in fact more like a government. That's something he's openly said. I think he kind of regrets framing it in that way because I think it's so revealing. And the fact that they've set up essentially what looks like a Chapter 3 court, Chapter 3 of the Constitution being a court to oversee decisions by Facebook, is this attempt to kind of reproduce in a private setting an organ of government, an organ of power in a liberal democracy. So I think it is really telling that Facebook seeks to control our online lives much in the same way that a government does, and seeks to gain legitimacy in doing so by setting up some of these external processes. And one of the things that I think really brought this home for me, that they are more like a government than a company, was this recent experience we had in Australia, of course, with the media code and the stripping of all news content from Facebook. Now, I thought this was a disgraceful thing for Facebook to have done, not least because we were about to go through a vaccination rollout. So health organisations had their content stripped, even if it wasn't actually news. But what I have a lot of objections to the media code as well, and I'm not sure the reform was actually a good one, and I think we could have done better. And I'm concerned about government acting at the behest of media companies rather than users and consumers of news and citizens. But that aside, I think what it also highlighted is that things that are public infrastructure, the capacity to build communities online, is essentially a function that has been ceded to the private sphere. So Facebook obviously feels like a public space, but it very much isn't. It's a private one. And yet you could imagine a world in which, if the government had invested in the infrastructure necessary, we could have non-profit, non-privatized space to do some of the things that we do on Facebook, including building communities, having discussions about public policy, having health messaging delivered, having safety precautions like checking in after a natural disaster, which Facebook offers. Facebook's very much interested in not portraying itself as an essential service when it comes to something like media regulation. It weaponizes its users to advance its bargaining position with government. But I think what it really highlights is that we shouldn't have necessarily conceded this space to a private sector company. And then in fact, that should be part of our regulatory outlook when considering how to regulate these companies. So of course, they're too big, they need to pay more tax. It's not just me that's saying this, of course. They've been hauled up in front of various committees in the United States. Everyone's probably seen footage of tech CEOs talking about why they shouldn't be broken up. But I think we also have to remember that we need public investment in some of these digital spaces in order to replace these private alternatives that otherwise do end up occupying these spaces, much like unregulated dictatorships. So I would say I don't think these companies are too big to regulate. I think that antitrust, for example, has a long history of squarely raising the issue of large companies being a threat to democracy. That antitrust law is not just about ensuring markets operate functionally, it's also about making sure that no company is too large to be dictatorial towards government. So I think antitrust is a big part of it, but I also think we need to look at other fields of regulation and other fields of government investment to counter the power of big tech. So, at Digital Rights Watch, we would say that privacy law reform is actually critically important. And that's because unless we stop these companies relying on data extractivism as a business model, then we can't really control how these things might influence our public spaces, how things like disinformation go viral online, how they're part of that business model of big tech. Well, let's stop data extractivism being the source of profit for these companies. And I would say as well, I think it's really interesting to watch this in Australia, where we maybe don't have access to the same antitrust weapons in the armory of the US government, because these companies aren't headquartered in Australia, they're headquartered in the US. That doesn't mean that our competition regulator has been idle. And people in the conversation may know that, in fact, the ACCC has done a whole investigation into the dominance of digital platforms and has been looking at reforms in this field. We're currently undergoing a review of the Privacy Act, which is partly why I raise it, because I think if you're interested in these topics, this is a critical moment in which we can start to advocate for better privacy protections that actually attack the business model of big tech that gives rise to these insidious consequences. And I think that that's a very important role that local regulators can play to enforce, to build up and enforce privacy laws that can undermine the business model of big tech, and as a consequence, also undermine the surveillance capability of the state. One thing that I think is really easy to forget in this particular climate is that it's not just that surveillance capitalism is focused on extracting data from users. Actually, governments work in partnership with companies to make use of that data themselves. And we've seen the rise of companies like Palantir, for example, which is a data analytics company based in the US that actually provides services to local councils in places like the United Kingdom, to many social services and welfare service providers in the United States. And their model is around building up regimes of knowledge, of analytics, based on public data sets as well as private data sets like social media to be able to deliver welfare services more efficiently. And of course, more efficiently doesn't mean the same thing to everybody. It doesn't mean seeing people who use the welfare system as holders of rights. It means cutting back on welfare service delivery. So I don't think we should assume that surveillance capitalism is something that only the private sector benefits from, that actually it dovetails very neatly with often with many government programs that are aimed at making sure they know a lot about their citizens without their citizens necessarily knowing a lot about governments in return, which is not just something that I'm saying, it's actually something that's been canvassed by the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty, who talks explicitly about the digitisation of welfare and how this public-private partnership, which is focused on surveillance and data extractivism, is feeding very regressive welfare policies. So I think it's absolutely critical that we look at things like antitrust to break up big companies, that we look at other kinds of ways to regulate markets to make them more competitive and not so dominant by single companies or monopolistic companies. But I think it's also really important that we look at building up our laws around privacy so that we can empower citizens to stop those twin sources of power continuing to oppress them. And that's private companies as well as governments as well. So I'm really excited. Oh, go on, Rana.
Sorry. And I think you mentioned really, really well that what is ignored in between all of these powers that are struggling to get the data and work on that and use it or sometimes abuse it are the end users and the public and the grassroots who are easily gave the consent to, and it's really interesting to me. It's a matter of the trust. As a community engagement person, I can see that how people and the public are trusting this private sector and this social media much better than the trust that they give to the governments, and they are happily share their data, and they're providing the market for this private sector actually to sell our data as a second hand to the government, instead of government coming directly to the people and create that relationship and trust. And I think one thing that you mentioned is the Privacy Act that needs to be updated. And if there is any regulation that you think, is there any way for government to trust, to create that trust and use this type of data instead of buying these second-hand data sets and working with private sector? Why government doesn't come directly to people and create that relationship to use that data and cut this part out of this relationship, basically?
Yeah, and it's interesting. I saw a question in the chat there, or a comment, I suppose, from Annette talking about whether we can use consent as a meaningful way to understand whether people are participating in this economy freely or not. And I think that's an important point to raise, just based on what you said, Rana, that we often talk about privacy as being an individual issue that someone can contract out of, that terms and conditions mean that we consent, we're prepared to give away this privacy. I mean, if I could have $1 for every time someone says to me that people give away their privacy on Facebook, so why should we worry about the government surveilling us? I'd be a very rich person, and I'd probably donate it all to Digital Rights Watch. But the point, of course, is that people don't necessarily want to give up their privacy. They don't often have control over these things, and it's not meaningful consent. So, I mean, among other things, what I would say is that even if you've never given away information about yourself, the capacity of some of these large companies to create lookalike audiences that map demographically to you means that they can often make assumptions about you, even if you've shared nothing about yourself personally. So there the age of big data means that individual ideas of consent are somewhat meaningless in the context of giving away data or the data economy. And I think that's an important thing to remember, because it means then that it's not up to the individual to manage their privacy or take responsibility when they've given their privacy away. It's actually an important thing for us to deal with structurally, that we need regulation, that we need to dictate terms to companies rather than leave it to the individual to bear the consequences and responsibility for their privacy in circumstances where that's not realistic. And other jurisdictions are doing this. Someone also in the chat mentioned the GDPR. I think that setting up baseline expectations for how companies will deal with data protection and as well as personal information are pretty critical. We lag well behind actually most jurisdictions, because we don't have a Human Rights Act. So most comparable jurisdictions to us, we lag behind, but also we could adopt quite easily some of those regimes as a baseline standard and then expand from there that are coming out of Europe, but we don't. But this is perhaps the moment to start calling for this as we're going through privacy reform. So the point that you mentioned, of course, is about public trust, which I think is, I wanted to talk a little bit about the public health crisis of COVID-19, because I think this is where we've seen this play out. Not one of the big reasons why I think a lot of public health and tech policy projects fail is that people do not trust the government to handle their information well, to do the right thing by them, to do their bidding as citizens rather than the bidding of the surveillance state or large companies. And that absence of public trust is actually very costly to us as a society. It's not just something that people are careless about or suggests that people aren't interested in collective well-being. I think we actually have to put that back on government and ask them to earn public trust so that when these health crises evolve, they've got the reserves of that goodwill to be able to implement projects. And there's ways that the government can do that. We had a huge argument with them about the contact tracing app. And people may remember, Scott Morrison was talking about how that contact tracing app was like sunscreen. You could put it on and then you'd be protected from COVID. And that kind of attitude, to my mind, highlights a very rudimentary understanding of how technology works, because of course it won't protect you from getting a virus, but a real dumbing down of this conversation rather than an owning up and an attempt to treat us like adults in terms of understanding how this technology could work. So instead of framing this as something about people not downloading the app because they're jealously guarding their privacy at the expense of the collective, I think we have to think about it differently, which is the government could do more to instill public trust in the population, and it would be more successful in its public health projects, particularly when they concern technology, if it did so. So in the context of the contact tracing app, we advocated for an open source design, for a set of legal standards that would go with it, that very carefully protected data that would be shared or handed over to health organisations, that allowed the individual to have a say in that. And all of those things gradually happened, but all a bit late, and the project ultimately failed. And I'm not saying that's the only reason the project failed, but I think it is a critical one. And so what I think we should look back on that period, how I think we should look back on it is to say, well, the government has now set the standard. It did commit to having an open source design for that app and for having legal standards that did protect privacy. That's the minimum that we should expect for public health tech projects in future. And I would like to see the standards elevated for all the attempts that they make in future to use technology to solve public health problems. And I think that's really important, because I do think technology's got a really important role to play. I think people are really committed to collectively doing their bit, which may involve giving up some of their privacy in order to get a public health outcome that's good for everybody. And I think we've seen that on a pretty daily basis around the country as people do the right thing by each other. But we shouldn't let government get away with blaming individual people for their own failings. And I think too often we can assume that politicians don't understand the technology they're talking about, or perhaps in too much of a hurry to get to the bottom of a particular problem. And I would argue against that. I think often they do know exactly what they're doing, and they're trying to have a conversation with us that is dumbed down, that is simplistic, and that doesn't instill public trust, so they ultimately fail. And we're the losers in that context. We end up being people who suffer as a result of their mismanagement. So yeah, that's really what I wanted to talk a little bit more about now, how I think we should really, we need to really reframe how the government talks about these kinds of things and stop allowing the government to inculcate a culture of surveillance as part of everyday life, as part of being a citizen in the digital society, that must be what you have to give up. And I've looked at this topic in my book and in my writing before, but one of the arguments that I make in my book is looking at where this idea or this immense power of the surveillance state came from, and how mass surveillance has been portrayed as a necessary public good for a very long time. To do that, I try and draw a line historically from the first modern police force all the way through to the modern surveillance state. And people are sometimes surprised. I'm sure the intelligent audience here will not be surprised. But the first modern police force only really came about at the end of the 18th century, in the early 19th century, and it really coincided with a change in how society was organised economically, as people were starting to come in from regional areas and work in urban environments for wage labour. And essentially, the professional police force was set up by the first professional police force was set up by a bunch of merchants in London who understood the value of surveillance as a cheap and effective way to monitor their workforce, and that inculcating that culture in workers themselves means that it didn't need to be enforced as heavily by professional police. So a very effective way to do this. And the prevention of crime was always treated as synonymous with public safety. But in many ways, I would argue that what they were doing in the late 18th century was essentially managing and entrenching social division and quashing any resistance to the status quo, which was really steeped in exploitation and inequality. Now, I think the modern police today do many different things, but I think that history is still part of what they do. That essentially we've built an invasive digital apparatus, or governments have, to be able to, and this is justified on the basis of preventing crime, and it's often the worst kinds of crime is the other thing I would say, like terrorism and espionage and pedophilia, or as I like to call them, the three horsemen of the authoritarian apocalypse. That when we talk about these things, the sheer immorality of those offences really forecloses any debate about the tactics that we use to guard against them. And that's why we've seen in Australia some of the most egregious laws passed of anywhere in the world that undermine privacy, that undermine our rights to collectively organise, that give immense powers to police and national security agencies with very little accountability. And that's something that I think we should absolutely be concerned with. The most recent iteration that people might be interested in is the Online Safety Bill, which has just been tabled in Parliament. I think the Online Safety Bill does some really important work in protecting people from online abuse and bullying and the like, and there's some really good aspects to it that are well overdue. But I think there's also in it very expansive powers that have been granted to the eSafety Commissioner with almost no accountability, with very few appeal rights, and with no transparency around how these decisions work. And instead of this being a discussion about the limits between autonomy and responsibility, of working with vulnerable people to hear how regimes for enforcement could work better, we see essentially the government treating us like children, riding over concerns roughshod. And I would say in relation to the Online Safety Bill, hundreds of submissions were received by the government that were pretty much wholesale ignored in the parliamentary process that we've just seen. And instead what we see is a commitment to offering powers of surveillance, of being able to take down content with little accountability as a way to solve these kinds of complex problems of the digital age. So I find that very distressing and very frustrating as a digital rights activist to see how this happens over and over again. And our capacity, I think, is growing to be able to resist that, to be able to have a conversation where we aren't treated like children, and we are able to have a discussion around how we limit the worst excesses of the digital age. But I think we do it from a position of disadvantage when we don't have human rights principles at the centre of our legal regime or in our public conversations about these topics. And that's affected, policies like the Online Safety Bill, but also, of course, any kind of technology initiative in the public health space where privacy and respect for people's autonomy and control of their information is kind of patched on as an afterthought when lawmakers and policymakers are put under pressure rather than something that's put at the centre of the design process. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about how this is obviously not just an Australian phenomenon, but is in fact a remarkably unifying theme of global politics. I mean, many Americans, as I'm sure everyone realises, love to talk about freedom from excessive government, but they do remain heavily committed to funding and maintaining the national security and law enforcement agencies that do this kind of work. So this is certainly not just an Australian problem. It is a problem that activists and advocates all around the world face and try and contend with. And I think it's telling that even in a society like the United States, there's resistance to the very idea that safety could be achieved in different ways, or that community resilience might be a contribution, or building important community infrastructure might be an alternative to funding and empowering law enforcement and national security agencies to deal with these problems. But I would say there's often a contrast that's drawn between the United States and China, for example, and there's good reasons for that. I think powerful technology in the hands of elected presidents is certainly concerning, but it's almost a different beast in the hands of autocrats. It's a very frightening phenomenon. But I do think we can see some of a similar tendency play out, where there's a real commitment to surveilling citizens, to avoiding anyone thinking that they might be able to deviate from the norm, that essentially you risk being locked out of society if you don't comply with the rules of a surveillance state. And this prospect hangs over everyone in China who risks essentially a life of social isolation in the event that they become a dissident. And that weighs heavily on the capacity of the society to have a public discussion about these things. But so what I would say about that is that Beijing and Washington often highlight their differences in diplomacy, but like so many nation states, and including Australia, there's a tendency to approach the opportunities presented by the digital revolution in very similar ways, that there's a commitment to surveillance that's held in common by the ruling elite, both in social liberal democracies and autocratic regimes. And while, companies in the United States might be heavily involved in that, so the private sector is more involved, whereas in China, it's much more a state-oriented process of building up the surveillance capacity, I would say the tendency is the same, that those in power want to watch those that they have power over. And we need to think about ways to stop that trajectory, to stop the escalation of that comes with technology and the development of technology. And that the reason is, of course, not just that I think individuals have rights and autonomy and are entitled to freedom, but it's also because I think it means that we squander the huge potential of the digital age on these projects of surveillance, these projects of data extractivism, rather than what I think we could be putting this technology to use for. So I do, Gramsci often talked about it as requiring a pessimism of the intellect and an optimism of the will. And that's how I approach digital questions. I think that we do have immense problems with how power is exercised and set up in the digital age, but we have the great potential to shift that. And in fact, I think we've got a duty to do so, because if we don't, the potential of the digital age will be squandered. And I think that what we need to do to be able to realise that potential is we need to find new ways to organise, to become active, to bring people into the movement in support of digital rights, so that it can be a diverse one that represents the interests of many different groups in society, rather than just, say, technologists or computer scientists. So I think we need to build movements that really force policymakers to feel that they're responsible to their constituents, and encourage them to realise that their jobs will be at risk should they make decisions that are not in the interests of the public. We need companies to feel the existential dread at the prospect of selling out their users and profiting through data mining private information. Given that so many countries are struggling with similar questions to the ones that I've discussed today about how to hold governments and companies accountable in the digital age, this kind of organising kind of naturally lends itself to a form of digital internationalism. So I would say that the moment that we find ourselves in is both frightening and exciting, that people are beginning to reject the kind of political bargain that they've been sold, where we all must give up our privacy and autonomy for public safety and convenience. And that the experience of the pandemic demonstrates that Governments need to earn a social license to use technology in particular ways, and this requires that they should stop behaving like secretive autocrats. Companies, I think, need to stop demonstrating haughty indifference to the rights of people who use their products, or treat privacy issues as something that's only a concern for people who wear tinfoil hats. And this is an emerging political dynamic that I would argue has been pretty hard fought for by activists in lots of different spaces to reframe the potential of the digital revolution, to find the holes and the problems, and to reveal who holds power in this particular moment as a way of then building the resistance to change it. So when so much is in the balance at this particular moment, where the rules are still being set for the digital age and the world is contending with the very vast changes that are brought about by the pandemic, imagining, and also in the context of the spectre of much more grand problems like climate change that in fact will be more impactful even than the pandemic, I think that we've got to take this opportunity to argue for technology that's more democratic, that's designed in ways that are decentralized, that use open source principles, that we don't allow companies to be the people who design these regulations, who take ownership of this particular regulatory impulse and then do so in their own interests, and that we don't allow governments to rely on this idea that they will always deliver safety, even when they're making policies that are largely unaccountable and lacking in transparency. So in fact, I think we need to start talking about these things, about how transparency and accountability are integral parts of the design process of technology, that's how they should be, rather than afterthoughts or patched on later when the opportunity to gain public trust has already been squandered. And we need to learn how to say no to technology that might be developed when it can't offer protections for the most vulnerable members of society. And we've seen that recently in that a number of companies, for example, have begun a moratorium on the use of facial recognition technology and the development of that technology, because these companies do not believe that governments can be trusted to use it. Our own Human Rights Commissioner here in Australia has been talking about a potentially similar move in Australia, where we've seen police forces experimenting with facial recognition technology, often without any accountability or transparency. And there's a real question about its efficacy. And even if it was very good at what it said it would do, whether that's the kind of technology that we should have in a society that does respect individual rights. And so I think this is a conversation that we should be having. If we can't make technology respectful of human rights, then maybe we shouldn't be building it at all. So those are the kinds of conversations that I think we need to have, that essentially, rather than just assuming that big tech is the problem or that government is the problem, to see them both as sometimes cooperating, sometimes at loggerheads, there's no doubt, but certainly making sure that we see them as two central sources of power in the digital age that both need to be held accountable in different ways. And I think that, in fact, this is a critical task that we need to take up, far from, I suppose where I'd end is by saying that far from these being particularly novel debates or concerns, that in fact these questions have been questions that people have been asking for a very, very long time, that they've got a very long history. And that's one of the things I try to do in my book, to map out how technological problems might be presented as particularly new, but in fact they're often human, political, social problems that we've been debating for a very long time. And so I think the best kinds of answers are going to come through generating conversations between historians and technologists, between coders and artists, between engineers and lawyers, and that will give us the best opportunity to navigate this particular crossroad and take the path that will ensure that the web is a place of connection and flourishing rather than oppression and surveillance. And I suppose I would say, lastly, to quote Leonard Cohen, that there's a crack in everything, and that's how the light gets in. And the last few years have shown us that the cracks in the digital age have shed light on the problems that it's created. And our job is to use that light to navigate towards a more digital, democratic tomorrow.
I was enjoying so much that I didn't want to stop you actually and ask any more questions by myself, but I can see a lot of interesting questions, and it shows actually the interest in the conversation in the chat. So I may ask some of the questions from the chat. I'm afraid that we may not have to ask all of the questions, but I try to pick up some of them because we're going to have some conversation and we are going to do some breakout rooms later on to have the continue the conversation later on. So I'm asking Mark Zirnsaw question: did Digital Rights Watch have any conversations with the e-safety commissioner about the kind of human rights abuses they have attempted to address online and obstruction and resistance online corporations provide in response to facilitate the human rights abuses?
Yeah. So this is a great question. So I think there is work that the Safety Commissioner does really well in terms of talking about how you can take kind of abusive material as well as bullying material, which is the other part of the e-Safety Commissioner's remit, is to look at bullying online. And I think there's a really important role for the e-Safety Commissioner to play. And we've certainly had conversations about that, and we've talked about this issue. And I think companies are often criticised for behaving in lawless ways, and that's not just true in relation to tax or, say, content moderation in relation to news and Facebook, for example, but I think that's also around things like complying with various laws to be able to facilitate criminal prosecutions. I would say I do think companies do cooperate with law enforcement agencies and the like, perhaps more than we realise, and certainly when you talk to industry bodies, that's something that they like to remind civil society organisations of. And I don't have a concern with the using proper powers to pursue criminal conduct and, find ways to try and make it stop. But I do think we need to be careful about assuming that giving an institution like the e-Safety Commissioner more power is necessarily going to solve that problem, especially in a context in which stakeholders haven't been consulted with, who are quite vulnerable users who may be caught up in projects or expectations set by the e-Safety Commissioner in relation to how companies deliver their services. So I think we could do better at making sure that when we give powers for these purposes, that there's appropriate limits, that there's appropriate mechanisms for testing that they're working as intended. Because too often, in my view, there are unintended consequences associated with broad-ranging powers to address harms, and we have no way of changing that after the fact. So I would have loved to see, for example, greater engagement with some of any of the submissions that were put in that particular act by the government, but essentially they've been largely ignored. And that's my beef, that we need to be able to have these public discussions instead of having these proposals imposed on us without consultation, without discussion of human rights principles, which is a recurring theme in the tech policy space.
Thank you. I just asked one more question. Actually, it's a good call to action, maybe. What are some feasible, actionable steps that we can take to get back to personal privacy and autonomy, which we have seemingly ceded to big tech and government?
Yes. So, I mean, I think there's a couple of different answers to that. The first one is, I think we need different laws. So if you're interested in privacy and reclaiming your privacy, you can get involved in the actual review of the Privacy Act that's currently underway. And that's what we're trying to do at Digital Rights Watch, to advocate for all sorts of reforms to these privacy laws that were drafted in the 80s, so are largely out of date for the digital age. I think that's one important aspect. Of course, like climate change, we're going to have structural solutions, but also local ones as well. So I think that's true in relation to technology too, and when it comes to questions of privacy. So I think while we might need those structural reforms, I think we can also do things on an everyday basis to protect ourselves. And, at Digital Rights Watch, for example, we've decided to disengage from Facebook because we're very unhappy with how the company behaved in relation to the online media code that with the stripping of news content. We think that was an unconscionable decision. And we think building a community of digital rights activists and people interested in these topics, that we'll be better off if we do it off Facebook. If we live the values that we say, but also we don't become wholly dependent on a large company that makes decisions in its own interests at the expense of users. So we think it's better for us in the long term to extract ourselves from that platform. And I mean, that doesn't mean we don't have Facebook accounts ourselves to talk to our friends and family, but as an organizing model, we think we've got to find ways to do this outside of being dependent on tech overlords. So I think that's something we can do if we are trying to build up resilient online communities, find other platforms to do that on, and find other ways to respect that community by giving them options outside of Facebook. So I think that's the kind of thing that, living and breathing and experimenting with alternative ways of organizing is the other thing we can do to stop this relentless dependence on Facebook and this assumption that things will always happen through those platforms, when in fact we could try and do things differently. And that's what we're trying to do at Digital Rights Watch.
Thank you so much. I apologize everyone who asked these interesting questions, and because of the time limit, I cannot ask them. Actually, I'm very happy. I think we are interested in the conversation and the presentation that you had. That's why we have so many questions. And probably we need to have conversation with each other, and it provokes a lot of discussion that we need to have further events and discuss more about that. I'm now going to, and thank you so much for the time that you spent with us. I actually really enjoyed, and I'm really happy. I said in the beginning, I'm honored. I can say I'm pleased that I had the opportunity to have this conversation on behalf of our amazing team in Conversation at the Crossroads. So we are going to have some more discussion, but before I give the discussion and questions in the breakout rooms, I wanted to give some information about what we are doing and where we are right now at the Conversation at the Crossroads. Since the public launch that we had a few months ago, we have been busy with mapping out a program for the rest of the year. In addition to events like tonight's discussion, we are planning to get a number of small discussion groups off the ground. In a week or so, we're planning to send our detailed information on this project with ideas on how people can become involved. Also, everyone can attend. Everyone who are attending tonight, also they can be informed. And it's really interesting because you already mentioned about finding other platforms. I think our discussion that during the previous months took us to having some events like small discussion groups, or have some book clubs discussion, or politics in the park and politics in the pub. Those who are tired of this online engagement and the platforms like Zoom, we are inviting them to join us actually to these type of activities, and let's have meaningful conversation with each other and get prepared to have this dialogue with the decision makers, and being able to share more information with the decision makers. I also wanted to mention in the beginning, when I introduced Lizzie, I talked about the book that she has. I wanted also to show you can see it on the screen, Future Histories. It's an amazing book. I think we can add some of our events because we are going to have a book club. Probably we will choose this. So if you decided to read that, it's a win for us because we can have a conversation about that and invite Lizzie again. As a writer, it's always amazing to have the writer in the events. So also, can I ask go to the other events? Yes. This is a really interesting event that we are going to have as our next event on 14 May. We had the opportunity to collaborate and sponsor a film screening, which is and also the conversation with William Kelly. It's a movie called Can Art Stop a Bullet? So I invite you to buy the ticket and join us. It's going to be in person, and we're going to watch the movie and have the conversation together. There are lots of information. We are very excited. We just started and it's just the beginning of the road and the beginning of the conversation for us. So I definitely invite you all to join us and work toward the meaningful conversation in the near future. So I stop here and I introduce the 3 questions. I also want to invite Lizzie to stay with us and join one of the breakout rooms. So if you're lucky, you get in with Lizzie and you will have more conversation. These are the 3 questions that we are putting in for you to have in the breakout rooms. You're going to have the conversation with each other. It's up to you how to go on with that. I don't think we are coming back here, but it's going to be an opportunity to have a chat with each other because I know we are all listeners. It's the opportunity to talk to each other as well. So I don't repeat the questions. You're going to have the questions in the chat breakout rooms as well. Thank you so much. If I didn't see you, good night for today and looking forward to see you again.
Thanks, Rana.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rana.
Thanks, Rana. That was great.
So are we having any interaction?
Hi, I think we're back to the main room.
Hello.
Yeah.
How do people find the conversations?
Too short.
A bit quick. A
I
bit
was
quick.
hoping-
Very short. Yeah.
Oh,
And I was only with one other person, and luckily we knew each other, so we had a chat about all sorts of things.
So we've got 30 people left.
I had Lizzie. She was just getting into the.
I've got a
nuts and
tendency
bolts.
to talk too long, so I was getting into the swing of things, and then I had 50 seconds to go. It's crucial
Yes.
injustice. We were blaming the tech overlords for such
That's what it
censorship.
is.
That's right.
I'm looking forward to listening to this again, Lizzie, because I missed most of it. So thank you.
Oh, thanks, Bernadette.
So hopefully this will be sent out, Joe.
Yes,
Yes.
it will. I assume we're recording it,
Yes.
so we should be able to be made available.
Thank you.
Really
But
interesting.
we have another issue, which is that 170 registered. I think quite a few had trouble joining.
Yes.
We had
Yeah.
lots of emails saying I can't get in.
Yes.
So
Yes.
we've got to
That was me.
investigate what the problem is.
Yeah. Someone sent another link. So I think
Yeah.
I tapped in about 10. Thank you, whoever sent that.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
I wonder whether
Thank you.
whether it's just the problem with having individual links, and whether or not that just we don't have enough to support all the different individual links.
I put the numbers in 6 times and it said incorrect number. And I
Yeah.
checked the number, it was
Yeah.
the right number. And it was only I just sent an email and I was given another link that I could join in.
Yeah,
So
I was the same. I was clicking the link that was posted to me by Eventbrite in the email, and it wouldn't allow me in. I had to sort of go through another way. So we can attend to that. Yeah. hopefully.
I'm not sure whether you actually had to register with Eventbrite.
I did have to do that in the end.
That was what I had to do, because I phoned Joe and I couldn't get in. And what I had to do in the end was to actually set up a password, have the password sent to my email, and then it let me in.
Right. Yeah.
Same here.
Can I ask people about their questions and what they thought about those questions that we had in the chat?
To be honest, Susan, I didn't get enough chance to take them in.
So the first question was, do you feel that social media is a medium that protects or undermines human rights? And discuss.
We had a really good chat with John. Actually, John was one of the people who asked an interesting question as well. So we had a good conversation. If John, you want to talk about that?
Well, I guess in short, it was both a blessing and a curse. Yeah, there were benefits and disadvantages. The organisational capacity, but then the loss of privacy within that, and I guess the monitoring within that. And yet Jude made the comment, he said, I think it's really important to have social media for it protects human rights. If we try and control the providers too much, we'll lose the tool.
That's true.
Scary thought. Yeah.
I really liked Lizzie's point that rather than leaving this to private enterprise, that we should have, we as people should be getting government to see that this is part of its remit, just like government is part of its remit. You know, it's part of its governance.
I think that's a really good point. And the other thing is that we sort of think as tech and government as being completely separate, but a lot of the tech that these platforms use is the result of government research and development, like the internet, for instance, and also Wi-Fi and plenty of other things wouldn't really exist without government. So it's not like they can't get involved if they were resourced to do so.
Can I ask you guys a question? Maybe I'm violating my rights as a speaker, but I think that's a great point, Alex. What would you think about like the ABC potentially being a platform that you'd experiment with these kinds of things? Because that's something that, for example, the Centre for Responsible Technology at the Australian Institute is pushing. People have talked about in the UK that the BBC is an organisation that could deliver trusted spaces for people to have public conversations. could an iteration of the ABC be around digital experimentation so that there's a public alternative to some of these private enterprise controlled spaces?
Lizzie, our group talked about that. That's what we decided we'd, sorry, it's Christian here. But I suppose my question, having never given that much thought, is what would it look like? Would it be a sort of an open platform? Obviously, I'm familiar with the BBC and the ABC, a little with the BBC. They're content providers in a certain sense. But what's the vision presented for a public, social media space?
Well, I think it's kind of an open question. So anyway, I'd be really interested to hear what you got.
I reckon that the ABC, if you went back 5 or 10 years, you would hear that that's what they were trying to do, that they were exploring that. And probably whoever talked about, it's about funding, isn't it?
Yeah.
Maybe they could do a trial of some description, especially you have Q&A, for instance, is a very sort of televised, at least in some ways, sort of engagement event. Maybe you could have a kind of smaller version on that for a particular amount of time so that you could test the tech. I don't know. It would require investment, and that's not the direction at least the current government is putting for the ABC. But I feel like iView and some of the things on the public broadcasters are actually really pretty impressive, the tech that they've got. When you look at On Demand and iView, sometimes it's less laggy, less problematic than the Foxtel alternative. So there's no reason why not, I reckon, if they're resourced to do so.
But my question will be, is a broadcaster a good platform to replace something like Facebook? Because I'm old enough to experience other platforms similar to Facebook. It's not the first, actually. We had Gazag, we had Orbit, and different platforms, very similar. And Facebook is a winner among them. But also we had some local, like in the country, because they filtered Facebook, they created a national Facebook for us to use it. And for news agencies like BBC, they try to influence and get involved with people inside the country, like BBC Farsi, but they were not that successful, and they couldn't use it because again, it's going back to the trust and the type of information that they are sharing. Because they are looked as a news agency and journalists, people are always more concerned about their privacy and the type of the news they're sharing. So I think if it's a totally new platform with the gadget and the tools that Facebook creates, like something national, that may work, but I'm doubtful about a news agency, and it doesn't matter if it's ABC or any other platform, because it's a news agency and the type of the work that they do is getting back to news and collecting information, not necessarily share and control and filter the sharing. That may affect the decision.
I'm just thinking about all of the the ABC for me for many years has had lots of programs where it's tried to get ordinary human beings' voices being heard. So I'm just thinking now of Landline, which is a country thing. I don't watch it, don't listen to it. It's not my thing, but I know it's, that's been going for a very long time, and it's very, very important. That thing about, I've forgotten what it's called, but asking questions, asking questions of different small minorities, the questions that nobody dares to ask. Like
Q&A.
No,
you don't ask this.
You can't ask that or something.
You can't ask that.
Yes. I mean, even Australian Story. But, if you went through what the ABC does right now, there are probably 20 programs that are attempting to get people's voices being heard. So, yeah, I'm not so... I'm talking, I'm just thinking about within Australia and the ABC and the role that it's played. I don't see that it's seen as it's certainly not seen as the government voice, because the government doesn't like the ABC voice.
Yes, there is, I think, the question of should it be the ABC as such, or should it be a public body like the ABC, but with a different mandate? But it would operate with a charter, it would have independence, and but it would be a public investment. As I understand it, but Lizzie may know more, a number of countries like Russia and China, admittedly with more authoritarian systems of government, have their own platforms. They don't use Facebook. They have their own platforms, and if they do and can do it, then there's no reason why it shouldn't be able to be done in a more democratic, accountable, and transparent way in a country like Australia. And the other thing is, I don't follow why it should not be possible to have a public body competing for space in the digital media the way others are doing. For example, we've now heard that Trump proposes to establish his own platform. It will be independent of Twitter and so on. And we know that he has been having consultations from his headquarters with the top, most skilled people in this field, with a view to bringing them into his stable, and he's threatening to, to steal a march on all of them. Now, I don't know whether he'll realize it, but I think it's quite feasible that someone with enough investment and able to bring into the organization the best technical brains, but committed to a different social agenda, wouldn't be able to succeed, provided, of course, the investment and the will is there. And yes, current governments may not be tuned into that, but that would change if the public demanded it with sufficient force. And of course, the public isn't yet sufficiently apprised of these issues to be able to do it with force and muscle, but hopefully that might well turn out to be the case in the next few years if the preparatory work, the homework is done.
One of the challenges, Joe, of having a national social network, though, would be that it would be national, right? I guess one of the benefits of something like Facebook is that it is international, and there's people that are connected right around the world. I personally, I'm not a big fan of Facebook, but I wouldn't want to be on a social network that was exclusive to my country, because I love that diversity of being connected to people elsewhere.
Yes.
So I'm not so sure that'll be a challenge.
It should be able to do that. As I understand it, and I'm no expert, as I understand it, you can from Australia, if you wish to, tune in to the Chinese platform. And many from the Chinese community do just that.
Okay.
Of course, it's primarily, as I understand it, in the Chinese language, Mandarin, I assume, but there's no reason why it couldn't be multilingual as well.
I was interested to know what platform Lizzie's using now. She's not using Facebook.
I think it's a good question. I'm glad you asked. We do use Action Network, which is a platform for community organisations, which is we prefer because it's got good privacy credentials, but we mainly communicate with people via email. And so like when we're having this conversation, we think about substituting Facebook with something that looks like Facebook but isn't the same. And I think perhaps a better way to think about it is Facebook provides lots of things. That's one of its objectives, to be the place that you go rather than the internet at large. so at one point, though, you can find a date on Facebook, you can apply for a job, you can also look at your mum's photos, So part of what I think we might want to think about is how do we break up those different services and they get offered in different ways. And so you might have a social network that's completely international, but you may have a news service that picks up, it's much more able to be monitored and created by you, that gives you access to headlines from all around the world, different places, but without necessarily checking in on you or getting data about you, like an RSS feed for news. And then you might have content, like cultural content, that is local and specific to your place. So there's all sorts of different ways in which I think we could have different services delivered that don't do what Facebook does, but that do offer kind of public alternatives for bits that Facebook does. And we're trying to do that by using public platforms like Twitter and email, and then hopefully that's a way that you can build a resilient set of people who know what you're up to, and also in-person events, so these kinds of things. But there's some interesting other examples of media companies who've experimented with extracting themselves from Facebook with much greater success. There's a great example in New Zealand, actually, where they've done that and they've seen no harm to their business model. They were protesting how Facebook dealt with Christchurch, and they divested from the platform essentially, and they've had nothing but success. And I think that's a model that other news companies should follow. So it's different for different people and different organisations, but I think there's great potential there if you want to put your mind to trying.
I wonder if there's a way that obviously one of the things that makes Facebook so successful is it is that one-stop shop for everything, and so it's really the only social media network other than sort of Instagram, really, maybe, that is an alternative, but Facebook owns Instagram anyway. So I guess it's interesting, how else would you be able to have like a confederate of different social media networks, or if you could not necessarily be exclusive to one network, but plug into a group of sites that they have. I don't know. This is just a random idea, but it's the kind of thing that maybe is an alternative to one network.
Alex, I was going to say that's an interesting thought, and it sort of touches on an issue that occurred to me a few times while listening to Lizzie's talk and reading some of the questions, because it does now open up the possibility that the public, or we could have a discussion in the public sphere of precisely what kind of technologies we want to have rather than regulate after the fact, right? So one of the issues with technology over history is it really hasn't been democratized from the get-go in terms of what technologies are developed. We then have to respond and regulate and so on. But shaping technologies from the get-go in a public space would be a really interesting social experiment, and one I think probably worth thinking about. I haven't got anything in mind specifically, but I know this is something that's been discussed by many people who are interested in how to democratize, other ways of democratizing technological forms, of communication. So, yeah.
I guess one other challenge is how do you promote Joe's vision of greater dialogue between groups and people with different views? Like Trump might set up his own platform, but then who's going to go to that? Maybe just his supporters, so you get an echo chamber but no real dialogue, or you set something up and you just get the mutual abuse that you might get on Twitter exchanges. Don't know how you get around that. Depending on who people see as having set up the platform, they may or may not choose to engage with it.
There is another dimension which Lizzie hasn't mentioned. There have been moves which I think have not progressed because national governments have stood in the way, and that is international regulation. At the end of the day, only international regulation can work with something that is cross-border. And digital communication, by definition, is cross-border, it's transnational. And the reason why the Facebooks of this world have this enormous advantage is that they're not nationally bound. They have this global reach. And for institutions that have global reach, at the end of the day, whether they're producing manufactured goods or providing services or providing a digital platform, There is only one answer in the long run, and that is international regulation. International regulation. Which of course has to be accountable and transparent and all the rest. But then once you've closed the loopholes, there's nowhere else to go. The regulation covers the entire planet. We do have it in some respects, but not in the area of digital technology. The UN has made some efforts, but these efforts so far have been stymied by major powers, by governments, which are jealous of their own control, which of course is ephemeral because they don't have very much control as of now. So you do want a really effective World Health Organization if you are going to make effective responses, prevention and treatment of pandemics. But you have to give that World Health Organization the adequate resources and the certain capacities which are presently denied to it. So it should be able to go into China and into Australia and anywhere else if there are issues that need to be investigated on the health front and have access to resources. It should be able to do it transparently and accountably, but that's what one expects of the World Health Organization. And that's why the criticisms of it are quite beside the point. They haven't been given the resources or the necessary powers, capacities, to be able to exercise their functions properly. And we do certainly need an international digital regulatory body, hopefully to complement and parallel national jurisdictions, but national jurisdictions working collaboratively. I know that sounds utopian, but at the end of the day, whether you're looking at climate change, digital technologies, pandemics and health-related issues, or any other issue, the answer will stand or fall by the quality of international governance side by side with national and local governance. It's a tier that we don't give enough attention to at our own peril.
I think that's true, especially when it comes to pandemics. It has, like, maybe it was criticized, the World Health Organization, but it's probably been the most prominent international sort of body in a while, in terms of it being quite relevant for a lot of different governments, more relevant maybe than some of the security ones who are sort of seen as their advice not always followed, and maybe sort of embodying more altruistic goals.
That's true. Thank you so much, and thank you especially because you stayed far longer than expected. And thank you, Lizzie, for staying with us. I think we should wrap it up, and it somehow shows us how important is this conversation and this dialogue, and probably we need to continue this. So we definitely will think about having another opportunity to invite Lizzie and all of you, and also we will share the recordings. Those who could not see and join us from the beginning will have an opportunity to watch the recording as well, and probably we will share that with everyone who registered. And I think it needs to continue this conversation, and we need to be active in the space because it's such an important part of our life these days. Thank you so much again, and I think that's it from us. And I actually looking forward to see you on 14 May as well, if you can join us.